Most people think organic waste is just something to get rid of. But what if the real story is that it's also one of the most misunderstood energy sources we already have in everyday life? At first glance, the idea sounds almost too simple. Food scraps, grass clippings, leaves, and plant material are thrown away every day, and the assumption is that they're just waste. But when you start looking closer at how organic matter breaks down, a different picture starts to appear. And that's where things get interesting, but also where expectations usually start to drift away from reality. A lot of people imagine organic waste as a kind of hidden power source sitting in plain sight. Something that, with the right setup, could reduce bills, create independence, or even replace parts of the traditional energy grid. That expectation is what pulls many into the topic in the first place. But when people actually try to understand how it works, they usually run into the same confusion. Because organic waste doesn't behave like a fuel you can simply plug into a system. It behaves more like a biological process. And that difference changes everything. Most frustration comes from that gap between what people expect and what the system actually does. On the surface, it seems logical. Plants store energy from the sun, so why not just reuse that stored energy directly? But the real challenge begins when you try to convert that stored biological energy into something usable at a consistent scale, like electricity for a home. That's where the assumptions start breaking down. In practice, there are only a few main ways organic waste can be used for energy. One is direct combustion, like burning wood. Another involves biological breakdown, where microbes decompose material and release gases like methane. And another involves more industrial processing methods that refine and capture energy in controlled environments. Each of these approaches works, but none of them are as simple as they first appear. And this is where the hidden structural layer becomes important. The visible layer is the waste itself: grass, food scraps, leaves. The invisible layer is everything required to turn that material into usable energy: temperature control, moisture balance, containment systems, time, and in many cases, infrastructure that manages gas capture or heat conversion. Without those conditions, the process doesn't scale in a meaningful way. That's why so many small-scale attempts feel underwhelming. It's not because organic waste has no energy potential. It's because the conversion process is sensitive to variables most people don't see at first. Moisture content alone can completely change how efficiently organic material breaks down. Too wet, and it slows decomposition. Too dry, and biological processes stall. Contamination from mixed materials can also disrupt the process entirely. So instead of a simple energy in, energy out system, what you actually have is a controlled environment problem. And that leads to a key turning point in how this topic is usually understood. The real issue isn't that organic waste lacks energy potential. It's that extracting that energy consistently requires structure, conditions, and time that most everyday setups don't account for. Once you see it that way, the conversation shifts. It's no longer about whether organic waste can produce energy. It becomes about how much control you have over the process that unlocks it. From there, a more grounded perspective starts to emerge. Instead of thinking in terms of replacing traditional power systems entirely, it becomes more useful to think in terms of supplementing or understanding energy flows at a smaller scale. Things like composting, biogas systems, or thermal recovery each operate under very specific conditions, and each comes with trade-offs in efficiency, complexity, and maintenance. And that's usually where expectations and reality finally meet in the middle. Because while organic waste is abundant, it's also inconsistent. It's seasonal, it varies in composition, and it requires handling before it becomes useful in any energy context. That doesn't make it irrelevant. It just makes it different from conventional energy sources people are used to thinking about. When people step back and look at it this way, the topic becomes less about a hidden solution and more about understanding systems. Energy production is not just about materials, it's about the conditions under which those materials are processed. And that understanding changes the question entirely. Instead of asking whether organic waste can power something directly, the more accurate question becomes what kind of system is needed to make it reliable, predictable, and scalable. That's the point where most misconceptions clear up. Not because the idea stops being interesting, but because it becomes more realistic. And when you remove the assumptions, what's left is a clearer view of how energy, biology, and infrastructure actually interact in everyday life. A structured breakdown of these systems, including how different organic processes compare in practical terms, is available in the description. If you're interested in exploring this further, you can also find a practical guide and a step-by-step framework that expands on how these concepts are typically approached in real-world applications. And as always, the goal isn't to push a conclusion in one direction or another. It's simply to understand what's actually happening underneath the surface. Because once you understand the structure, the rest becomes a lot easier to evaluate.